Well, I hope you're enjoying the fall weather that has finally arrived. Beautiful sunshiny day. How many of you would agree that we live in troubled times? How many of you would also acknowledge that there really hasn't been any time in the history of the world that hadn't been troubled? If you're a student of history at all, you know that the world today is no more and maybe no less troubled than it ever has been and likely ever will be. We here in our country, here in the United States, have been privileged to be a part of a minuscule little slice of history that basically is unique in the history of the world. The world really hasn't experienced what's happened in the United States in the last 200 years. We are absolutely not the norm. We are the exception. And it's just been our great privilege to be a part of that. And we could talk for weeks about how that came about, what has sustained it, and likely what will cause it to go away. But I think it's worthwhile to remember once in a while that we are indeed the exception, and that the world for Christians, as it has always been, is a very, very dangerous place physically. And just came across this week. I've known for a while that Nigeria has been one of the worst places for Christian opposition and Christian persecution. But it just really comes home when you see the statistics. This year, over 4,000 killed, more than 2,300 abducted by Islamic terrorists. Nigeria, if you know anything about the country, is kind of split north and south, with the north being overwhelmingly Muslim, the south being somewhat predominantly Christian, and there being some blending within that, but the threat to Christianity, the threat to a person proclaiming the name of Christ, is probably greater in Nigeria than pretty much anywhere else. You could say, well, how could it be worse than in the Middle East? Well, in most of the countries in the Middle East, there are very few Christians, and the ones that are there are deep underground. So you don't see this the way that you do in Nigeria. But the astounding thing about this is those 4,000 or so that were killed this year, and it's been happening year after year. The only thing they had to do to stay alive was to denounce Jesus Christ and accept the Muslim faith. That's all they had to do. And yet they chose this. I'm not sure what the fastest growing religion in the world is. Do you know, Kevin? It may be the Islamic faith. If it is, and I suspect it is, it's largely at the edge of a sword or at the end of a spear. Anyway, praise God on this Veterans Weekend as we celebrate the liberty and the freedom that we have in this great country of ours. So when you get discouraged about the politics or anything else that's going on, just remember we're the greatest place a Christian can possibly be. To our text, John 4. This was a government official. Remember that Jesus is in Cana, and this government official is coming from the area of Capernaum. There are about 4 different ways you can say that. Now, probably all of them are wrong. I've always said Capernaum, but most of the ones I hear say Capernaum. Anyway, he has come in person because his son is very, very sick. He was a government official in the service of King Herod Antipas. And we don't know his name from text, but there's a passage in Luke chapter 8 that says Jesus was accompanied by the 12, the apostles, and by some women, including Mary Magdalene, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's business manager, also Susanna and many others. I just wonder if this guy in John 4 may have been Chuza. It could have been. Not that it matters, but I just thought that was kind of interesting. So he is over in Capernaum, and he travels 20 miles, a day's journey, a pretty hard day's journey, over to Cana, where Jesus has found himself at this particular point in time. When he heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went and begged Jesus to come to Capernaum, about a day's walk from Cana, to heal his son who was about to die. He's a man who has a degree of faith, doesn't he? He has enough faith to travel. I don't know how he traveled. I don't know if he walked or if he had a horse or what mode he had. But he traveled a day's journey on the basis of his faith, with the idea that the only way Jesus could heal, if he could heal, would be for him to come and be present with his son. He also felt that it was important enough that he, even though he was an official, was not willing to delegate or relegate that duty to somebody else to go try to summon Jesus to come and heal his son. Jesus said, unless you people, and I think he was talking to the Galileans, not to Chuza, if that's who this government official was, unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders, you will never believe. This sounds like a rebuke almost to Chuza, to the government official, and I can't believe that that's really what's intended here. He came in faith. And he came on the basis of what he had heard, not what he had seen. So I think that there's probably much more to the conversation than the very concise amount that we get in these gospel accounts. You know, we get the Reader's Digest version of everything, right? So we don't know all of the rest of the conversation that's going on. But Jesus is somewhat perplexed here because the people are having such a hard time believing him. And there's a certain amount of rebuke in this. It seems there's never enough evidence. They're always demanding more. The official pleaded, Lord, please come now before my boy dies. Then Jesus told him, go back home. Your son will live. And the man believed what Jesus said and started home. While the man was on his way, some of his servants met him with the news that his son was alive and well. I put the little Greek words in there, and I would normally try to pronounce them for you, but Kevin's here today, and so I'm not going to. It would be too embarrassing. But I only did it because it's another illustration of what we kind of miss in translation. We really see this like in the word love. We talked about that a lot. How many different Greek words there are behind our English word love. Here, even though we're talking about the same little boy, there's three different references here. One is the father's very tender naming of him as his beloved son, his beloved child. And then Jesus responds in the more formal, dignified manner. And then his servants, when the servants meet him to tell him that his son's now going to get well, will use the more domestic, familiar but not familial form of that. So he was on his way, and his servants met him with the news that his son was alive and well. He asked them when the boy had begun to get better, and they replied, yesterday afternoon at 1 o'clock, his fever suddenly disappeared. Then the father realized that that was the very time Jesus had told him, your son will live. And he and his entire household believed in Jesus. He believed before he left Capernaum. He believed when Jesus told him it was going to happen without him having to go to Capernaum. And now he sees with his own eyes the evidence of it, and so he believes. 3 levels of faith, right? Faith that Jesus can or might do something. If he didn't believe he had the capability of doing it, he wouldn't have left and traveled a day's journey to find him. So that was a level of faith that he had. Then he had a faith that created a demonstration, because when Jesus said, your son's going to live, he was happy with that. He was content with that. He accepted that by faith and left. He didn't stay and plead and beg and try to coerce Jesus to go. He said, you said it, that's good enough for me. And he started back home. And then there's the faith that comes from actually seeing the demonstration of Jesus' power in healing his son. Then John says this was the second miraculous sign Jesus did in Galilee after coming from Judea. And I think that, the parenthesis has been added in here. The second sign that he did in Cana of Galilee. He did other miracles, as we know, and he did miracles while he was down in Judea, in Jerusalem and various places. But this is the second sign that he's performing now in Cana of Galilee. And of course we know, and we talked several times about the fact that John is going to focus on 7 signs, 7 miracles that he's going to select out of Jesus' biography to relate as a way of building faith among those who would read his words. Jesus was many things to many people, right? He was certainly a rabbi, a teacher to his Talmudim, to his disciples, to all of those who followed him. And by the way, we think about Jesus being followed by 12 men, and that's true, but he oftentimes had a very large entourage, a number of disciples who were following him. They just weren't the ones that he had selected specifically for that role. And many of them, of course, were women. Mary Magdalene, and as we saw a while ago, the wife of the official from Capernaum, and that, in my understanding, would have been extremely countercultural. That was not something that any other rabbi you would have met in Israel would have done. He would not have had women in his entourage. And he certainly would not have had women sitting at his feet. What does it mean to sit at the feet of Jesus, like Mary did in Mary and Martha and Lazarus' family? And what I'm sure Mary Magdalene did as she traveled with Jesus for 3 years. To sit at the feet means to be a disciple, a learner, which means the rabbi is teaching them, which is what rabbis did not do with women, to my knowledge. So he was a teacher, he was a preacher, and we'll eventually get to the Sermon on the Mount. But perhaps more than anything else, he was a healer, or as much as anything else, he was a healer. He was a healer of the body, broken bodies, diseased bodies, and he was a healer of the mind and the psychological part of us, as we'll see going forward. So here we have the case of Jesus healing the son remotely of the official from Capernaum. So what can we learn about this, about the heart of Jesus? And that's not a rhetorical question. Anybody? I don't have Mike here today, so somebody's going to have to step up. No takers? All right, well, I'll tell you what I think, among other things. Number one, he's no respecter of persons. We know that already, but this is another demonstration of that. This is probably a Jew who is working for the son of the king who tried to kill him. This is Herod the Great's son who's ruling now in Galilee, and this is an official who's working for him, and it's his son. If we read the text as being somewhat rebuking when he says that you're demanding a sign, we can kind of infer from that Jesus was very easily persuaded by a sincere faith to act upon whatever that request happened to be. In this case, heal my son. And of course, we certainly can see a demonstration that his power is not limited by time and space. He didn't have to spit on the ground and make some mud and put it on the boy, and he didn't have to lay hands on him. He didn't have to pray over him. He didn't have to do anything. He just had to speak the word, and the boy was healed. Any other thoughts? Last chance. We're moving on. We're going to begin now the great Galilean ministry, being rejected by those in Nazareth, including his brothers and sisters. Jesus moves his home. I don't know if I should say his sisters, because I don't know if they rejected him or not, but we know that his brothers didn't believe him. Hadn't really thought about that. I assume that they were of the same mind. The Jews would expect Messiah to set up shop in Judea and Jerusalem, home of the temple, center of the priestly worship. But instead he chose Galilee, he chose Capernaum, home of rabbinical development and the synagogue worship of the common people. Capernaum, I think, had a reputation for being more of a center for training, developing rabbis even than Jerusalem did, and that's where Jesus chose to be. Luke 3:19 says, John's public preaching ended when he confronted Herod, the ruler of Galilee, for his many corrupt deeds, including taking Herodias, the ruler's sister-in-law, as his own wife. Herod responded by throwing John in prison. Just without really getting bogged down in this, just to kind of get us all up to speed on what's has happened thus far. Jesus, of course, his parents living in Nazareth, traveled to Bethlehem where he was born. From Bethlehem, he went to Egypt to get away from Herod, then back to Nazareth, and then during his growing up, traveling to and from Nazareth to Jerusalem to be there for the holy days as was required by the law of Moses. Then beginning his journey, his ministry from the River Jordan where he was baptized over to Cana. See the miracle of the wine. From Cana to Jerusalem, spent some time there, and then back up to the Jordan. Then from Jordan up to the middle of Samaria, where we were a couple of weeks ago, was the woman at the well at Sychar. From Sychar to Cana now, and from Cana, where he has just performed this miracle of healing the son of the government official, and back to Nazareth for a time, and then from Nazareth he's be going to Capernaum. So that's kind of the 30-second upgrade on what's happened in Jesus' life thus far. When Jesus got word that John had been arrested, he returned to Galilee. He moved from his hometown Nazareth to the lakeside village of Capernaum, nestled in the base of the Zebulun and Naphtali hills. This Isaiah prophesied sermon came to life in Galilee the moment Jesus started preaching. He picked up where John left off. Change your lives. God's kingdom is here. Reading from the Message translation. Zebulun and Naphtali. Do those names mean anything to you? You know what those are? We'll get to it. This move completed Isaiah's sermon. Land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, road to the sea, over Jordan, Galilee, crossroads for the nation. People setting out their lives in the dark saw a huge light. Sitting in that dark country of death, they watched the sun come up. This is a quotation from Isaiah chapter 9, almost verbatim, seems like. Land of Zebulun and Naphtali, the way to the sea along the Jordan, Galilee of the Galilees. The people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of shadow of death, a light has dawned. Speaking, of course, of the coming of Messiah. Land of Zebulun and Naphtali, these are the two of the 12 tribes, if you remember those names. They're kind of nestled right in there in Galilee, just on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, if you can read it from where you are. They butt against each other with Asher between them and the Mediterranean. This is a land that was allotted by Joshua when they came into Canaan, into the promised land so many years before. Named after the 12 sons of Jacob. Jesus returned to Galilee, powerful in the Spirit. News that he was back spread throughout the countryside. He taught in their meeting places to everyone's acclaim and pleasure. He came to Nazareth where he had been reared, and he always did on the Sabbath. And as he always did on the Sabbath, he went to the meeting place. He went to the meeting place. Where did he go? He's in Nazareth, and he went to the meeting place. Where do you think? Where do you think he went? You don't know? Maybe it was there. I took that picture in Nazareth. We didn't eat there, but I bet it would have tasted just like it does here. Got the same sign anyway. Now, of course, he went to the synagogue. When he stood up to read, he was handed the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. It's my understanding that the Jewish people in the synagogues, and maybe it's still that way today, they had kind of a calendar of reading that would take them through Torah and through the writings in the prophets in a given period of time. And I guess maybe some of the Catholics and others have liturgies that they follow year after year, where you know what's going to happen every month because it's on the calendar. So he comes here and he's handed the scroll. What's wrong with that picture, by the way? I mean, besides the fact that Deborah and the Davenports are sitting there. Well, and this is in Nazareth, by the way. In Jesus' day, I don't think Deborah would have been sitting there. Is that right? She would not have been allowed. But the scroll is probably a very good replication of what they would have had, that they would have handed to Jesus. He's got some renown now. He's got some fame. Some people are aware of him, and so they've invited him to read the assigned passage that day, and so that's what he's going to do here in the temple here in Nazareth. This is kind of the replica that they have of that synagogue. I said temple, I meant synagogue. This is the replica of the synagogue there in Nazareth now. Some of you may know Dennis Koss. He was with us on that trip. And this is part of a recreation that they've done there. Synagogues have an interesting history. Our English word is really a transliteration of the Hebrew. By definition, if you look at Strong's definition, it's an assembly, a congregation, a synagogue, either the place or the people gathered together in the place. And it's my understanding that the only requirements for having a synagogue was that you had to have 10 or more adult Jewish men. You could meet anywhere and have a synagogue as long as you had 10 adult males. In the Reformed Jewish movement, you don't have to have males necessarily. You can have women in a blend of the two. the Reformed Jewish movement has really embraced the role of women. I think I've told you before, but when I was volunteering as a chaplain at Memorial Hermann here in Houston, there was a period of time there that we had a female rabbi serving in the pastoral care role at Memorial Hermann. The synagogue, I don't think that we know precisely the beginning and development of the synagogue. It certainly was a replacement for the temple. It took the place of the temple for people who didn't have access to the temple. I'm of the opinion that it began either in Babylonian captivity or as they were coming out of Babylonian captivity. I'm not sure exactly which, but it's been a permanent fixture all these years. And of course, after AD 70, it became the primary place of Jewish prayer because the temple was no longer, it didn't exist anymore. The Romans had completely destroyed it. The synagogue is a place of prayer, a place of worship, a place of reading Torah. That's kind of a synonym. When you say worship and reading Torah, it's the same thing because to them, reading Torah is worship. And that's very much an integral part of their worship. It's a place of displaying historical art and artifacts. It's a classroom for education. It's a place for a community gathering. I was kind of interested to learn that the scrolls that they have in a synagogue are kept in a cabinet, and that cabinet, usually rather ornate if they can afford it, is called, of all things, an ark. So the scrolls are kept in the ark, and some of those are really very elaborate pieces of furniture. And it takes a pretty good size ark to hold a complete recording of the Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament, by scroll. So unrolling the scroll, he found the place where it was written, "God's Spirit is on me. He's chosen me to preach the message of good news to the poor, sent me to announce pardon to sinners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the burdened and battered free, to announce this is God's year to act." Quoting from Isaiah chapter 61. He rolled up the scroll, handed it back to the assistant, sat down. Every eye in the place was on him intently. So, purely by accident, without design, he sits down, walks in, and they hand him the scroll, and he opens it up, and lo and behold, it's on this passage about what? The coming of Messiah. Who knew? Had to be an accident, right? Couldn't have been by design. Because, they're following a calendar, right? Yet there it is. I underline pardon to the prisoners just because when we get to it, we're going to find a time when John the Baptist is in prison and he's going to send a message by some of his disciples to Jesus to ask him if he's the one or if he should wait for somebody else, which is a really strange story because John the Baptist is the one that had announced him. And we'll try to unpack that some more when we get to it. But Jesus quotes this back to John through his disciples, this same passage. But interestingly, in the quotation that he takes back to John, he leaves out pardon to prisoners. And I think what we're going to find out is that John is not asking him, "Are you the Christ?" He's asking him, "Am I going to get through this? Am I going to survive this?" And I think we have a remiz here where the rest of the story is pardon to prisoners is not in the cards for you. But we'll look at that again when we get to it. Then he started you just read Scripture. You've just heard Scripture make history today. This Scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. It came true just now in this place. All who were there, watching and listening, were surprised at how well he spoke. But they also said, "Isn't this Joseph's son, the one we've known since he was a youngster?" A couple of things that are really striking there. They have just heard Jesus announce to them that he is the Messiah that they have been praying for hundreds of years. And seemingly it just blows over their head. However, he did it really well. He spoke well. Hey, this kid's pretty good. They were surprised at how well he could speak. Because after all, we've known him since he was in diapers. His dad's a carpenter. His dad's a stonemason. Jesus said, he's going to say, prophet's not without honor except in his own country. That's coming next. You're no expert because we know you. So my question is, what is an expert today? Who's an expert today? When I was growing up, we used to say it was anybody who traveled 100 miles to be there. I don't think we can say that anymore because 100 miles isn't very far. Maybe it's somebody from another state or something. But we still struggle with really giving credit to people we are familiar with, more so than somebody who's come into our midst by invitation as an expert. Of course, the guy sitting next to you, you've known all your life, he could probably go over there and be an expert. He just can't be an expert here. Anyway, he's made this powerful proclamation, and yay, sounds good. He answered, "I suppose you're going to quote the proverb, 'Doctor, go heal yourself.'" I don't know where that proverb came from, but obviously it was well known by the time that Jesus spoke it there in Nazareth. "Do here in your hometown what we heard you did in Capernaum." So he's been, news of him has traveled far and wide, and they know about what's been going on. Well, let me tell you something. No prophet is ever welcomed in his hometown. Isn't it a fact that there were many widows in Israel at the time of Elijah during that 3.5 years of drought when famine devastated the land? But the only widow to whom Elijah was sent was in Sarepta in Sidon. And there were many lepers in Israel at the time of the prophet Elisha, but the only one cleansed was Naaman the Syrian. When they heard this, the people in the synagogue were furious. It didn't bother them that Jesus had just declared himself to be the Messiah, apparently. But now that he is making this comment, they are furious and jumping up. They mobbed him and took him to the edge of the hill on which the city was built. So let's get the geography a little bit. Zarephath and Sarepta, Obadiah refers to it as a Canaanite town in Obadiah 1 and 20. It appears in the Greek form Sarepta in Luke 4 and 26 in the King James Version. It's located in, I guess that's modern-day Lebanon, halfway between Tyre and Sidon. They're not far from the Mediterranean Ocean, not too far from Capernaum, just to put you into location. During the severe drought in the reign of King Ahab, Elijah sought out lodging with a widow in Zarephath. And miraculously, the widow's small amount of flour and oil was not consumed until the famine came to an end. When her son died, Elijah brought him to life again. You remember that story? Naaman, you know that story well. In 2 Kings 5, the leper from Syria is sent to Elisha, where he's told to dip 7 times in the Jordan River. There's Syria up there just north of Israel. Why were they so furious? Number one, Jesus was equating himself with the greatest of Jewish prophets, Elijah and Elisha. He was declaring that he was the Messiah of the world, not just God's little darling. What did these events that he talks about with Elijah and Elisha, what did they have in common? The people that were involved in the healing were not Jews. They were foreigners. And Jesus is saying, I am coming as the Messiah, but just like Elijah and Elisha, I'm not limiting myself to the chosen Jewish people. I am a Messiah for the world. And it just completely blew their mind. They got enraged to the point that they were ready to kill him. I just took this picture when we were in the northernmost part of Israel, up in Dan. And this is a picture of Syria and Israel. And the border is right there where the arrow is. So for a group of people today that are at war with one another perpetually, if you happen to live up here in this particular part of Israel and Syria, you can make war with rocks. You can throw at each other from house to house. It's that close. I just had no idea that there were settlements that close to the border between the countries. I seem to have lost power to advance. There we go. They intended to push him over the cliff, but he slipped away through the crowd and left them. How in the world did he do that? How did he do that? Do you know, David? I don't know either. I don't know. It wasn't his time, of course, so it wasn't going to happen. We know that. But I don't know if Scotty beamed him up or if he just was man enough to bully his way through them or whatever, but it didn't happen. He moved safely away from the situation. The picture here is about 2 miles from Nazareth. It's called the Mount Precipice, named after this particular event. But don't know for sure that's where they took him. May have been. It could have more likely was closer to the city than that, if they were good practicing Jews, because this 2 miles, this was happening on the Sabbath. And that would have violated the Jewish law if they had taken him to Mount Precipice, because that's more than a Sabbath day's journey. So it could have been one of the cliffs there closer to Nazareth. I think we're going to stop there. Our time is up. We'll pick up there with the narrative next Sunday, Lord willing. We're going to meet Peter and Andrew and James and John in a very interesting way, and we're going to meet Peter's mother-in-law. So we'll pick up that story then, Lord willing, next week. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your attention, and have a wonderful, God bless week.